few slides that highlight some of the key elements of earthquakes. And I guess you could say, well, one of them is, what is an earthquake? And an earthquake is the release of typically elastic stress that accumulates within the crust or the subcrust of the earth. And it involves slip of blocks of the crust, commonly on faults, typically on faults actually. Almost all earthquakes occur on existing fault lines. That's where strain is most easily released. So a key element of kind of looking at earthquake hazards is trying to determine what faults can potentially generate earthquakes. In other words, they're seismically capable faults, because the crust of the earth, at least in areas where plates have collided with one another, interacted with one another in the past, are riddled with faults. If you look at British Columbia, there are probably millions of faults cutting the crust. These are the product of plate tectonic processes that have operated over hundreds of millions of years, and not relatively few of them are in a position to accumulate strain and then release strain by this slippage. And typically this occurs at depth, and the depths can range wildly. But you have essentially the first slip, the initial slip from a point within the earth called the hypocenter, or the source, above which at Earth's surface is the epicenter. The epicenter is a projection of the source onto Earth's surface. And this is commonly what people think as being the source of an earthquake, but actually there's a third dimension. They occur at depth within the crust. And then as that energy is released, it propagates outward and upward toward the surface as a series of waves of different types. And they can propagate at the Earth's surface, or they can arrive from depth. And there are many different types of waves. I look upon them as kind of this discordant symphony of energy that's moving that's being released and propagating through the earth and up to the Earth's surface. And these include what we refer to as body waves, and these are key. There's the very fast-moving primary waves, which are kind of push-pull. You can think of a Congo line where people kind of pull apart a bit and come together a bit. They're compressional waves that are fast-moving, and they are body waves. They travel from the source up to the surface. And on the surface, you have, of course, people or property. They're going to feel the motion from these push-pull or primary waves. And slower waves, also body waves, slower are the shear waves. And these kind of are undulatory. They have a wave, how would one put it, almost a snake-like pattern of movement. And because they're not fundamentally push-pull, they're more shear type waves, these can be very damaging to built structures. And in fact, a lot of the damage due to shaking from earthquakes is a result of these shear waves. And you can kind of sense that intuitively, because they will tend to shear a structure as opposed to just compress and extend the structure. Kind of structures are a little bit better able to handle these compressional, extensional primary waves than they are these shear waves, which can induce quite different forces on a structure. You'll have to ask Carlos about that. He is the black belt on this topic. And then there are waves that propagate from the source, reach the Earth's surface, and move as surface waves. And examples of those are love waves and Raleigh waves. And I won't go too much into those. They get a little more complicated. But the net result is, over a period of time, in a large earthquake, you get all these waves sort of interacting with one another, and you get this discordant symphony of energy moving ground that is quite terrifying in a large earthquake. And then another key thing that one has to understand is what is earthquake magnitude? Now, earthquakes range in magnitude through many orders of magnitude, you know, from earthquakes that are so small they're not felt, up to the largest earthquakes on Earth. The largest one historically was the Chile earthquake in 1960. And seismologists have come up with a way of kind of enumerating earthquake magnitude, but it's not a linear scale. It's what we call a logarithmic scale. So if you look at the numbers on the base of that illustration there from 3 to 10, these are what we refer to as magnitude values, in this case, moment magnitude values. And as you go from one unit to the next, you are increasing the amount of energy released by about 30 times. So if you go from a 3 to a 4, well, a 4 releases about 30 times the energy of a magnitude 3. If you go from a 5 to a 4, a 5 releases 30 times the energy of a 4. So the difference between a 3 and a 5 is 30 times 30 or 900. You can see that this can really jack up. So when you're talking about a magnitude 9 earthquake, it's not like 6 times more energy release in a 3, it's orders of magnitude more energy. And almost all magnitude scales are of this type. They're logarithmic scales, and there are many of them that seismologists use. I think the most commonly used one is the moment magnitude scale, which provides a pretty good measure of the amount of energy that an earthquake releases. So on the vertical scale there, you've got another logarithmic expression, in this case, the amount of energy released. And you see kind of, there is a relationship in this log-log plot. It's not a linear plot, it's a log-log plot. And I'm going to show you another one in the next illustration. But on that diagram, there's the energy released of a number of quite large, well-known earthquakes, all of them very damaging, from, say, the earthquakes in California, the San Fernando earthquake in 1971, the Loma Prieta earthquake, very, very damaging earthquake in 1989, and then up to the big boys, you know, what we call subduction zone earthquakes, some of which we've experienced historically in my lifetime and probably in most people's lifetime that are living here. As I mentioned, the Chile earthquake, it was a magnitude 9.4, I think, or 9.5, the largest earthquake that we've experienced. The Alaska earthquake, not too far behind, the Good Friday earthquake in Alaska in 1964, and the Sumatra earthquake in 2004. There was another earthquake in Japan that I don't have on this figure. It's a little bit out of date now. The Hokkaido earthquake that would plot up in that upper right corner. And just to scale it, you know, you can say annual US energy use. Well, the US burns a lot of energy, and the Chile earthquake released that much energy, and the annual total energy use in the United States. So important to realize that the key take-home message from this slide is the magnitude scale is not a linear scale. So when you go up from a 3 to a 4 to 5 to 6, you're actually going up as many, you know, you're multiplying it by very large amounts each time you go from one unit to the next. And this kind of comes into play in terms of if you look at earthquake hazards in any particular region, say a region that is prone to earthquakes, you're going to find over a long period of time, if you have data that extend long enough back in time, there's an inverse relationship between magnitude and the likelihood of that earthquake occurring. And in both cases here, these scales again are logarithmic. So, you know, you have here a magnitude 2 earthquake at the far left of that diagram. You might get 10 of those a year. If you go out to the farthest little circle there, a magnitude 5 earthquake, the vertical axis would tell you you might get one about every 50 years or so. And that gives you a measure, a probabilistic measure, not a true predictive measure, but a probabilistic measure of the likelihood of an earthquake occurring within any given region over a period of time. And this is based typically on empirical data. It's based on the earthquake record from a given area. And to be perfectly honest, I forget where I got this data set from now. I got it a long time ago. But it's, you know, if you look at those data, you're going to say, well, you know, you can get a pretty damaging earthquake on a time scale that becomes significant. Say on average, one every 100 years, you're up there in the magnitude 5 to magnitude 6 range. So this is the frequency magnitude concept. It applies with earthquakes. It applies with floods. I don't think you'd call it a law of physics, but what happens is you generally have on a log-log plot a line that defines that relationship, and the slope of that line gives you an indication of the likelihood of a damaging earthquake. At the ends of the graph, things break down a bit, and you have to make assumptions, in part because you don't have a lot of data at that high magnitude end of any scale. And the other thing is, this is cartoon-like, but I like to say, as in real estate, it's location, location, location. So given that you get far more energy released in a very large earthquake, say a magnitude 7 earthquake, the footprint of that earthquake in terms of damage is going to be much larger than a smaller earthquake. And again, it's logarithmic, it's not linear. So then when you switch from, say, looking at the hazard to the risk, the location becomes important, because if you have a magnitude 7 earthquake close to Vancouver, it is a honking disaster, really, in spite of all we've done to prepare ourselves for damaging earthquakes. I'm not saying that one of those earthquakes would occur. This is just conceptual, that if you had a magnitude 7 earthquake or even a magnitude 6 earthquake really close to Vancouver, it's going to be disastrous, because the ground shaking is going to the severe ground shaking is going to extend over a larger area, and it's going to be more severe, all other things considered. So from a risk perspective, you can get that same earthquake on the west coast of Vancouver Island, and it's going to produce damage, but the population, the infrastructure is much, much less than, of course, the population infrastructure in the Metro Vancouver area. So significant damage, probably not a disaster, but notable earthquake, a magnitude 7 earthquake. And then we go down to magnitudes where you can get damage if you're close enough to the source or epicenter, but it's not going to be as severe, of course, as it would be from a magnitude 7 earthquake. And you can see kind of the footprint pulls in. You have to be within probably about 50 kilometers of the source of a magnitude 6 earthquake to produce significant damage. I'm just pulling that out of my hat. But that same earthquake on western Vancouver Island, outside of Tofino or Ucluelet or Port Alberni, is really going to cause very small amounts of damage, because there's so little infrastructure in that circle that I've outlined there that you're going to see very little damage. But it still is a large earthquake, a magnitude 6 earthquake. It's bordering on the difference between an intermediate and a large magnitude earthquake. And then magnitude 4, that's generally below the threshold of damage. That conversation piece there actually did happen, and I happened to be on Saanich Peninsula when it happened during a period between Christmas and New Year's, and I felt it, but it didn't cause any damage, and the epicenter was only about 10 kilometers east of where I was at the time. And the media will pick up on an earthquake on west coast of Vancouver Island with magnitude 4. It will probably, they'll call somebody like John Cassidy or Carlos and talk about it, but it will not cause damage. So why do we have earthquakes? Well, I could talk about that for a long, long time, but I'm not going to. Just suffice it to say that We live near a plate boundary. We live near the boundary between the very, very large North American plate, which includes pretty much all of North America and extends out on the ocean floor of the Atlantic Ocean to the mid-Atlantic ridge where it's being generated. That plate is moving west and northwest towards the Pacific Ocean. And off our coast, off southern and central Vancouver Island, it is bordered by the Juan de Fuca plate, which is an oceanic plate, a basaltic plate that is moving down beneath the continent, moving down beneath North America. So it's subducting, we say subducting beneath North America. Back in the old days, when I was a student, they didn't recognize that this was a subduction zone. And there was a debate for a while after the plate tectonic revolution occurred as to whether, in fact, these two plates, the Juan de Fuca plate and the North America plate, which were newly recognized as plates, were actually sliding past one another and not accumulating any strain that would be released elastically as a great earthquake, as was happening everywhere else at subduction zones. We have one of the only ones where we haven't had a historic subduction zone earthquake, a great earthquake. However, you have to bear in mind that this area was only colonized and populated by people who kept records for the last 200 years, roughly. And in fact, we now know that the two plates are locked against one another, that strain is accumulating, and that we will inevitably have another one of these subduction type earthquakes. And we also know that, of course, indigenous people have experienced a whole slew of them since they colonized, well, since they arrived in North America more than 10,000 years ago. And they experienced one that is well recorded in their oral traditions. We think about 322 years ago, AD 1700, and I'll turn to that in a moment. So we now know that, that we are in store at some time in the future, and it's very difficult to predict, even worse than weather, to predict when that might happen. There are various efforts being made to try and forecast how close we are to the next one, but we don't really know. And as I'll show in a moment, the intervals between these magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes range anywhere from probably about 100 years to as much as a millennium. So, they're not regular. Mother Nature likes to throw curveballs at you. This kind of very irregular kind of repetition of these great earthquakes is just part of the complexity of how the planet works. So we also know, irrespective of the fact that we haven't experienced historically one of these magnitude 8 or 9 earthquakes, but we do get big earthquakes, and that's why people recognize that the Southwest coast is earthquake prone. And the diagram on the right just shows earthquake epicenters. It's an old diagram, but it really shows the concentration of them in part along the boundary between the North American Pacific Plate north of Vancouver Island, and inboard of that in Puget Lowland area in the southern Strait of Georgia. You can see there's a sharp cutoff there next to the earthquake that occurred in 1946. That just marks the northern limit of the Juan de Fuca plate. And what you don't see there are a lot of you don't see any earthquakes within the subducting, at the plate boundary off the coast. The plate boundary lies below the ocean surface off the Pacific coast there, south of central Vancouver Island. You don't see any earthquakes. Well, that's probably not because earthquakes don't occur there. It's just that we're in the lead up to the next big one, and we don't typically get earthquakes at that plate boundary unless they're big slips. So I want to talk about these historic earthquakes. I remember, I suppose most of you who are in Vancouver would remember this moment magnitude 6.9 earthquake, the Nisqually earthquake south of Seattle between Olympia and Seattle, which caused about $2 billion damage. It was a big earthquake, magnitude 6.9. And we also had a very large earthquake, even a larger earthquake in 1946 on central Vancouver Island that also caused a lot of damage, but at a time when the population of British Columbia was, geez, I want to say it's about probably 20% what the population is now, maybe less than 1 million people in 1946. So imagine if you had an earthquake like that centered around Parksville or Courtney today, what the damage would be, magnitude 7.3. So my whole point here is we know we can get these pretty large damaging earthquakes. And these two earthquakes, the footprints of them are shown in this slide. The 1946 earthquake, moment magnitude 7.3, didn't, as far as I know, didn't cause damage in Vancouver, but I've talked to people, I did talk to people, and probably they're not here anymore, but who gave me accounts of what it was like to be in Vancouver when that earthquake happened in 1946. And the Lionsgate Bridge existed and it was swaying like waves at sea. And one fellow told me on the Fraser Delta, he could look out over his farmland and watch the ground surface swell like waves at sea. So we were very close, if not just inside the fringe of the area that suffered damage from that earthquake. And there was some damage in Victoria, but it was felt a long ways away. And of course, the area, the epicentral area on central Vancouver Island suffered quite a bit of damage. The 2001 earthquake, the Nisqually earthquake, you can see these are to scale, caused $2 billion damage, occurred, 21 years ago. Our population is even larger now than it was then. But you can compare the footprints on those two earthquakes, magnitude 6.9, magnitude 7.3. And you can see the difference that apparent small difference in magnitude makes. It's really, again, reflects this logarithmic relationship between energy release and earthquake magnitude. Well, those are two earthquakes, two very damaging earthquakes that we've experienced historically. So I've kind of talked about earthquakes as all being the same, but we actually get three types of earthquakes on the south coast of British Columbia. And I'm just going to walk you through the three types. And this is a cartoon-like cross-section that shows two of those types in the bottom. There's earthquakes within the brittle crust of North America, the North America plate, and the sources there of earthquakes are shown in the blue dots. And we also get earthquakes independently, earthquakes within the subducting slab, the basaltic slab as it moves down beneath North America. They're not at the boundary between those two plates, they're actually within the Juan de Fuca plate. And you immediately can sense why it's important to distinguish these two types of earthquakes, because the shallow crustal earthquakes, the blue dots, are much closer to population centers. The pink dots indicate earthquakes where energy has to travel an extra maybe 30 to 50 kilometers before it even reaches the surface and is capable of damage. And earthquake energy tends to attenuate or decrease with distance, at least earthquake energy that's going to damage structures. So the result is that all other things being equal, these deep earthquakes in the Juan de Fuca plate are less destructive potentially than an earthquake of the same magnitude. It's shallower depths in the crust. So these earthquakes that are deep, the ones within the subducting plate, here shown as that kind of gray band extending down beneath North America, roughly, you know, project to the surface in that upper diagram. So the epicenters of those earthquakes historically are shown as yellow dots, and they're scaled according to magnitude. So you can see that some of those have magnitudes larger than 6 and are destructive, even though they're seated 30 to 50 kilometers below the surface of the Earth. And you can also see that there's a cluster of them in the southern Puget Sound area, including the one in 2001. So immediately, at least historically, based on historical data, you'd say that's pretty hazardous area for this type of earthquake. And that includes the Seattle area, the Olympia area, the Tacoma area. So it's a major population center. But you can also see, and this is a little concerning, that we can get magnitude 5, maybe even 6 slab earthquakes up close to the border or north of the border. There was one beneath Pender Island in 1976 that was about a magnitude 5.5, as I remember. And there was an earlier one in 1908, just south of the border, that had a magnitude of about 6. So these earthquakes are probably carry a lot of the risk that we face from earthquakes on the South Coast, because they're fairly frequent. You can see there's a large number of them historically just based on that plot. Why do we get them? Well, it turns out that the Juan de Fuca plate kind of is being flexed as it's going down. The steepness with which it descends into the mantle of the asthenosphere increases, and that puts a tensional force on the plate and allows that still brittle plate to rupture, to move along faults. The other reason is the subducting plate is actually torqued by part of it moving a little bit more northerly than easterly. So there's an arch there, and you get more kind of northeasterly directed movement of the slab beneath the southern Strait of Georgia, and almost due easterly movement beneath the southern end of Puget Lowland. And it's kind of an arch that puts tension on that plate, on that brittle plate. You go far enough east and that descending plate gets too hot to nucleate an earthquake. It's just basically too hot, too plastic to actually hold strain. Crustal earthquakes. Okay, these, conceivably are the potentially most damaging earthquakes that we can experience. Fortunately, they're less common, as far as we know, than the slab earthquakes. But these are earthquakes that occur along active faults that cut the North America plate. And we are finding more of these little beasties all the time. Most of them in the past were thought to lie south of the international boundary, south of Victoria. And I've labeled a couple of them there that are known to be active: the Seattle Fault, the Southern Whidbey Island Fault number 3, and the Devil's Mountain Fault number 4. More recently, number 9, which kind of extends into the eastern Fraser lowland. The Vedder Mountain Sumas Fault is now known to be active and capable of producing probably magnitude 6 or magnitude 7 earthquakes. And researchers have done a really nice job of showing that the Leech River Fault that goes through Victoria is an active fault. It's had at least a few earthquakes during the post-glacial period, the last 10,000 years. And most recently, the Beaufort Range Fault, number 7 there, has been shown to be active. So these faults are all capable of producing earthquakes. You can see that we haven't yet found one that lies right beneath Vancouver, unlike Victoria or Seattle. It's not to say that such a fault doesn't exist. There is a small fault beneath the central state or southern Strait of Georgia, the Strait of Georgia Fault. As far as we know, it's not long enough to really trigger a bigger earthquake, but still could be seismically capable. And again, I just emphasize, based on the experience of places like Christchurch in New Zealand in 2010, 2011, even a magnitude 6 earthquake at shallow depth with a source close to an urban area can be totally catastrophic to infrastructure. So then just briefly turning to the granddaddies of earthquakes, the subduction earthquakes I mentioned earlier. These result from the slip of the entire edge of North America over the subducting slab, over the Juan de Fuca plate. And we know now that that interface, that megathrust fault is partially locked in accumulating strain. And we know this from this wondrous technology, this differential GPS satellite technology that allows us to track points on the Earth's surface with accuracies of millimeters, a few millimeters. And since about 1996, seismologists, geodesists, geophysicists have been tracking the deformation of the surface and have shown that, you know, we're in a compressional regime here, that the spine of Vancouver Island is slowly, ever so slowly being raised, while points outboard of that are moving downward. We can also demonstrate through these data that Victoria is moving closer to Vancouver, ever so slowly. It's all consistent with kind of pushing a rug and getting it to buckle up, except that it's not quite that. You know, fundamentally, it's deforming in such a way, you know, at depth, that ultimately the resistance of that fault plane to slip is going to be overcome, and we will get slip over a very, very large area beneath the surface of the Earth, largely beneath the edge of the continent, beneath Western Vancouver Island and the offshore, but probably extending somewhat closer to Victoria. And the energy release from that earthquake could be as much as magnitude 9+. It doesn't have to be, it could be smaller, but these subduction zone earthquakes typically have magnitudes in the 8 to 9+ range. So how likely are we have a damaging earthquake? Well, again, you have to parse them out according to their sources. So here I've shown the three sources again: the crustal earthquakes, the slab earthquakes deep within the crust within the Juan de Fuca plate, and subduction zone earthquakes. We've had about, we think, 20 great subduction zone earthquakes in the past 10,000 years. And it gives a recurrence interval, an average recurrence interval of about 500 years, something like that. That's quite long. And as I said, the last one occurred in AD 1700. So we're getting closer to the next one, irrespective of the fact that maybe in extreme cases, you can have 1,000 years between successive magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes. So we worry about those. You know, the footprint of those is absolutely monstrous, and they would cause a lot of damage to particular types of structures. The deep earthquakes are probably, as I said, are large, you know, they carry the largest seismic risk simply because they're super common. I mean, common in my time frame anyway. Just in the basis of the historic record, we've had several of them since seismometers first collected data about 130 years ago, 120 years ago. So, you know, I'm surprised the last one was in 2001. We're kind of overdue. We're getting close to expecting another magnitude 6 or 7 slab earthquake. We haven't had one since 2001. Crustal fault earthquakes are probably less common individually, but collectively over this very large Pacific Northwest area where 10 million people live, it becomes a concern. You know, the question is going to be which of those faults is the one that produces the next earthquake, and how likely is that fault to rupture? So the last part of my talk concerns damaging earthquake effects. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I see I'm running out of time. But just to talk about, if we do get a damaging earthquake in Vancouver, what are the factors that are going to cause damage? And you're certainly aware of these. Fire is one. Even recent earthquakes like the Kobe earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake, were accompanied by fire due to rupture of gas lines and appliances that were triggering fires. Kobe earthquake, much of the loss of life, over 5,000 people were killed in that earthquake, and I think the majority of them died in the fire in downtown Kobe, the firestorm there. So it still remains a concern. Engineers are doing everything they can to harden our infrastructure, our buried infrastructure, so that fire becomes less likely and that we have the capability of fighting fires when they do arise, even after an earthquake. Ground rupture, we haven't had a ground rupturing earthquake in southwestern British Columbia. They're more common in California. California has legislation that limits where people can build on the basis of the possibility of surface rupturing. The Loma Prieta Act requires limits on development within a certain distance of active faults, but we don't have any similar legislation because we've never experienced ground rupture, as far as we know, on the South Coast during any of our historic earthquakes. And then ground shaking, the kind of iconic cause of damage during earthquakes. And this is right in Carlos Vendora's bailiwick. In terms of shaking intensities and the behavior of engineered structures when subjected to different types of ground motions. I'm not going to go into that, obviously. I was totally out of my element there. But shaking intensity depends on many things. It depends on the type of wave, on the distance from the source, and other things like geology and topography. So, the physiography, the landscape in which the earthquake waves are moving across the surface and beneath the surface can be impacted by subsurface geology and by topography. During the Haiti earthquake, it was interesting that there was disproportionate damage to parts of Port-au-Prince that were up on the hillside. They got hammered the worst compared to areas down near the port. And I would sometimes wonder about that, not anymore because I don't work there, but Simon Fraser, of course, is built on a nice little hill. I've often wondered if there would be any amplification of seismic energy as it moves up through the mountain from the subsurface. And that's kind of referred to as ground motion amplification. And we do know that subsurface geology and topography and basin configuration on a larger scale can cause differences in the intensity of shaking of, kind of 3 to 5 times in a metropolitan area. So it's very important to determine what those differences are. That's now being done in Vancouver. There's a very nice study that's being done to try and parse out how earthquake waves would behave within the Metro Vancouver area. And where would we get amplified ground motions? Where would we get de-amplification? There are parts of the Fraser Delta that would experience de-amplification of certain types of waves, certain wave forms. So all that's very important for planning and earthquake engineering. And then tsunamis, typically, not all the time, but the main source of tsunamis are these megathrust earthquakes, these subduction zone earthquakes. We've seen that in the huge loss of life from recent subduction zone earthquakes in the Indian Ocean and off Japan. And these are a big threat. We're in a little different situation here because the source of the tsunamis are off the coast, off the West Coast, And tsunamis, like earthquakes, their energy attenuates somewhat as they travel through tortuous passages like the southern Gulf Islands, such that although we would expect very large run-ups on the west coast of Vancouver Island and places like Tofino, Ucluelet, Port Renfrew, and Port Alberni, certainly along the Pacific coast of Washington and Oregon and maybe northern California, the waves would be attenuated significantly as they pass up Juan de Fuca Strait and then through the battery of the collective of southern Gulf Islands, such that we would expect, based on modeling, that wave heights, maximum wave heights in the Strait of Georgia would be less than 2 meters, sort of in the range of 1 to 2 meters, which is not zero. You can get some damage from even a 1 meter tsunami because these waves are, they're moving very fast, so they have high velocities, and they can certainly cause damage to anchorages, to pleasure craft that are anchored along the shoreline, of which we have probably hundreds of millions of dollars invested. And so this is a diagram, again, a cartoon, but it shows where we might expect to get a maximum tsunami run-up with the outer coast, fairly low tsunami run-up potential in the Strait of Georgia. And then, without going into detail, you've got issues there with kind of other types of tsunamis, landslides into inlets that can produce very damaging tsunamis as well. So we kind of worry a little bit about our lakes, our reservoirs that are bordered by steep slopes where landslides might come into that water body and trigger a tsunami. Liquefaction is this wonderful phenomenon. I say wonderful just because it's an amazing phenomenon. It's really very damaging. And most crustal earthquakes and other types of earthquakes as well, sort of granular sediments that are water saturated can transform from a solid into a fluid. And you can imagine if that happens at shallow depth, as shown in that cartoon at the bottom, that it can cause cracking, kind of movement of blocks of more competent material towards free faces like the Fraser River channel, just really can play havoc with subsurface infrastructure, not to mention sort of buildings at the surface where cracking occurs. And this was a major cause of damage during the Christchurch earthquake in 2012, I think there's a mistake there. So just roughly speaking, areas where this is most likely to occur are our low-lying alluvial plains, where we have water-saturated granular sediments, mainly sands, sometimes even gravels can do this. It's shallow depth that can actually make this transformation from a solid to a liquid if strongly shaken. So places like Richmond are a concern here. This is where we, in a worst case scenario, in a large earthquake, could experience a lot of damage and isolation of communities on the Fraser River Delta from the rest of Metro Vancouver. Bridges might be vulnerable. And other places where you might experience liquefaction are along sort of filled-in shorelines, filled-in inlets like False Creek. Fraser River Delta, of course, there's a shallow sand sheet that is highly liquefiable beneath almost the entire delta plain there, from New Westminster right down to Richmond and Ladner. And then secondary effects, landslides. We've seen how vulnerable our transportational infrastructure is to flooding in landslides. Imagine a strong earthquake, what it would do to our highways, which basically pass steep walled valleys, Sea to Sky Highway, the Fraser, Highway 1 in the Fraser Canyon. We would certainly expect lots of rock falls and And we learned a lot from the disruption of our transportation system from the atmospheric river disaster last November. I'm not sure we appreciate yet, by we, I mean the government, appreciates the consequences of an earthquake on our transportation. I don't think they do. And so we have this vulnerability that we saw in November of 2021 with flooding, but we can also have that vulnerability repeated in the case of multiple landslides along the same transportation corridors that were impacted by the flood. And you can see, you don't have to be the old saying, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see how susceptible these highways are to potential rock falls and rock slides. Even without an earthquake, we periodically have disruptions of transportation due to landslides. And then I'm going to close by mentioning, when it's over, it's not over. Oh, the Casey Stengel or something, it's not over till the fat lady cries, something like that, it seems. Earthquakes are not over until the aftershock sequences. And certain types of earthquakes can be accompanied by very, very long aftershock sequences, particularly the magnitude 6.3 Christchurch earthquake. You can see there the string of aftershocks, some of which were pretty big, that persisted for more than a year after the main shock. And if you don't think that freaks people out, you've never experienced an earthquake like that. You really can't fully return to a state of normality when, you know, every so often, you know, you're getting the ground moving in. And it's actually not feasible because you can't really re-engineer structures that need to be rebuilt without doing that. And so just my last slide is really, what are our vulnerabilities in my view? And this is kind of speculative, but is based on this experience looking at historic earthquakes in other parts of the world. Although our bridges have been seismically retrofitted, in a worst case scenario, we still could get damage to our bridges. And this is a real concern. This is critical infrastructure. We can expect landslides along the Sea to Sky Highway and Highway 1 in the Fraser Canyon. I worry about, although we're told not to worry about it, but I still worry about our port facilities, the Delta port, the airport, you know, facilities along Burrard Inlet or the harbor, the ferry terminal, Sawassa, and I worry about all those because they're in areas where liquefaction can occur. And one thing that we've seen from historic earthquakes is a real impediment to recovery is when you have debris from the exterior of buildings that are blocking roads. And so you have to have a plan to remove that, to reestablish the road network as quickly as you possibly can after an earthquake. Rupture of buried utility lines, water and gas lines. We basically, you know, we're highly vulnerable to that. There was a report done recently that suggested that there are large weaknesses in our buried utility lines that really need to be repaired before we have an earthquake. And just generally speaking, damage to critical infrastructure. If you've only got so many bucks, it's probably best to spend it on the critical infrastructure, fire stations, hospitals, cell tower, bridges, port facilities. And then, you know, in a worst case scenario, you have to have a plan for housing people that have been displaced from buildings that have been damaged, that have been red tagged and cannot be occupied. So in the West End, you've got a large number of people who might be displaced. Well, where are you going to put them? And just as a plug, if you want to know more about this, you colleagues and I wrote a summary of all this in a book that's available from Tricuni Press, and the kind of web address is right there. And I just point out that the person who operates Tri-Cooney Press lives in the Dunbar district. His name is Glenn Woodsworth. And so you've got a press that is has marketed a book on earthquakes and tsunamis right in your backyard. Tri-Cooney@telus.net, Glenn Woodsworth. And I think that's it. Went a little over John, but not very much. So I'm going to stop the sharing and maybe take some questions if you wish.
All right. Thank you very much, John. If anybody has questions, you can raise your hands or give me the thumbs up. Okay. Douglas, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Okay. So thanks for the presentation, John. I just had a question about in one of the early slides where you showed Vancouver Island and clusters of earthquakes, there was a gap between Vancouver Island and Puget Sound, and you said that that could be interpreted either as a quiet zone. It could be interpreted as a quiet zone because there's pressure buildup, or a quiet zone because there may not be much pressure developing at that point. And how do you distinguish between those possibilities?
Well, we kind of know how much pressure is building up in the crust because we can actually detect the movement of the surface of the ground using that satellite technology I mentioned. So you can not only detect that there's compression going on due to the collision of the Juan de Fuca North America plate, but you can also see that there's actually a little bit of a rotation of North America happening there. And so most of the crustal faults, the ones in Washington State, are kind of aligned perpendicular to that direction of rotation. And it's thought that that's enough independently of the fact that the two plates are colliding. It's sort of a separate stress regime that allows, magnitude 6 and 7 earthquakes to occur on those crustal faults that I showed. So we haven't had an earthquake of that type on any of those faults historically. That's why you don't see those types of earthquakes. You see a slug of these deep earthquakes. That the earthquakes I showed you in that diagram, there were a lot of epicenters in the Puget Sound area, but they're almost all of them, if not all of them, are these deep earthquakes. So okay. It's a different type of earthquake.
Okay.
When you get up to central Vancouver Island, there's that abrupt cutoff, where you get a lot of earthquakes sort of aligned along a line, east-west line, and then they pick up and they run up the coast. And those are plate boundary earthquakes in a sense. The ones that have cut across Vancouver Island are associated with an active fault that we call the Nootka Fault. And it marks the very north end of the Juan de Fuca plate. So it's a boundary, the northern boundary of the Juan de Fuca plate. So the total tectonic environment changes at that point. And that Nootka Fault is capable and delivers fairly frequent magnitude 6 and 7 earthquakes in the historic period. And so we would kind of expect, doesn't demand it, but we would expect that we could get another one of those on central Vancouver Island, the same type of earthquake that occurred in 1946. And so places that are probably most vulnerable to that would be Comox, Courtney, and Campbell River. That's where we would expect those more shallow crustal earthquakes. And then the line that go up the coast, they're all associated with another plate boundary. That's where the Pacific plate, the Juan de Fuca plate, doesn't extend farther north, but the Pacific plate is moving against North America. And so that line is really the boundary between those two plates. And that, I didn't mention it, and probably should have, is really a San Andreas type environment. That's where you get kind of slippage of we call it the strike slip type. And we had Canada's largest recorded earthquake along that fault, an 8.1 off Haida Gwaii back in 1949. So we know we can get pretty big earthquakes. Fortunately, and I always say this because I feel kind of smug, is that we had the good fortune to put our San Andreas fault offshore. Whereas, you know, the Americans insisted on running it right through San Francisco and past Los Angeles. So there's a big difference in vulnerability on essentially the same two structures that are almost identical, but one's offshore in the Pacific Ocean and the other goes through California. I spent a couple of years in Berkeley, as John mentioned, and I was kind of waiting for an earthquake. One never occurred. I was there before the Loma Prieta earthquake, and I was studying in Los Angeles before the San Fernando Valley earthquake. So I missed all the big ones. I've only experienced small earthquakes.
Okay, Hassan?
John, what have you done personally to prepare for an earthquake? Do you have an earthquake kit, and have you got plans with your family, or you're just not worried about it? I'd like to know what you feel.
I'm probably not terribly different from the average person. I worry about it. You know, I know there's a hazard, and I'm not sure that everybody in Vancouver really believes there is a hazard. Do have an earthquake kit. I live in I think a fairly secure building. It's a strata-tidal building that was built about 5 years ago. I live on the North Shore here. And my wife and I have talked about it. I don't have children, so you know that's something that I can remove from the equation. But we've talked about it. We have enough kind of food and water available to us that if that were disrupted, we could probably make do for a week or so. But you know, and I have an earthquake kit in terms of emergency supplies too. You know, things like appropriate footwear, flashlight, kind of a hand-operated radio. But I haven't, you know, part of it, I have to say, I have to be totally honest, there's a little part of me that's fatalistic, you know, which I think most Vancouverites kind of feel. You know, the emergency managers have a totally different perception of this than the average citizen. And, you know, our citizenry have been informed about earthquakes, and they're much more knowledgeable, I think, than they were, say, a few decades ago. So in that sense, they're better prepared. But, you know, how they would react in a disaster remains to be seen. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to know what you think.
Well, I think you need to plan up for more than 3 weeks of food and water at least, and supplies. And my concern is if it happens in July, that's one thing. But if it happens in a snowstorm or a Arctic outflow in January, it's something else. So those are my concerns, you know, for the bad weather.
Indeed.
But, you know, you have to gauge it for yourself.
Stock up on firewood.
I don't have a fireplace. It kind of works for me. You're right. And I kind of think like we were blinded by this heat wave last year and by the atmospheric river. And it kind of highlighted to me that in spite of what, you know, kind of the government tries to do to to prepare us for natural disasters, we are totally ill prepared. I mean, it seems like in my world that people are beautiful in terms of responding to a disaster. You know, there's wonderful things in terms of response, although not everything has been thought out. But in terms of being proactive, people are terrible. That's mine. Well, they're never ready. They're always like deers caught in the headlights.
Yeah.
And every time you see a big earthquake occurring, it's like, oh my God, I never thought it could happen here. Or, you know, this heat wave was another example. I mean, that was we even saw that coming. Atmospheric Environment Service predicted those high temperatures a few days before the heat dome got established. And look what happened. 565 people died because the government was not prepared. So I, in one way, feel like, no, we're not ready.
All right. All right. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much, John.
You bet. My pleasure.
And as I say, we'll get a hold of you to see about something in September on some of the other topics that you have available. And thank you everyone for joining us. And this has been recorded, so it'll be up on the DEEP website. And John is going to send us a copy of his presentation that we can put up as well. So once again, thank you everybody for coming out, and thank you for, Ollie, you got something to say?
I have a couple of words with you, if that's possible at the end of it.
Yeah, I'll stick around. All right, so thank you, everybody. And Carlos, nice to see you. We missed you on Saturday.
Yeah, well, but I'm still here. Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, I just want to plug John's book. It's fascinating. I strongly recommend it. It's very good. So you should have a copy of that.
Oh, okay. This is one of the professor things, eh?
Yeah.
Recommending other people's books. Once again, thanks everyone for joining, and thank you very much, John.
Okay.
Much appreciated.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, thank you.
And if Hassan has time to hang around for a moment.
Hassan, okay. Hassan, can you hold on for a sec?
Hi, Carlos.
Sure, I can hold on.
Okay.
All right. Are we it now? Okay, so I'm Ole Jacobson here, and I had a request from John. I don't know if you've already bought radios or whether you're planning to do it in the near future. But the thing is with the what I was thinking, I stay with that. The only thing is, that's why I sent you that can say treatment of radios that are license free from the Boy Scouts, because when you read the literature that the companies are putting out, these radios are good for 50 miles, which they are not. And the way the Boy Scouts have probably had some experience with their little column there with the actual expectations that you could, you know, if it's 50, it might be, if it's 50 miles, it might be like 2 kilometers or something. So they're overrating it. Another thing is, my suggestion was to get the, what are they, general radio, the 2-watt versions that you can get here. They will cover some of the what's the family radio frequencies as well. It will drop to half a watt when they do that. But I don't think if we were to use radios of that type on 19th Avenue in this block here, I'm not sure that we would reach up to you know, over the hill to the trailer up at the community center, for example. So really, I couldn't recommend a make model, because the big makers are making them. You know, Motorola and some of the other Midland and some other are making these radios. But it will really be best to actually try some if you haven't already bought. And if you haven't, I'm not going to say anymore. And I don't know, have you got any thoughts on that, Hassan?
Well,
Yeah,
first of all, Oli, we haven't bought anything yet. And
Yeah, but it could be Hassan has some experience with handhelds more. See, all I have now that I got a call sign is I got an ICOM, but it's a 2-meter radio, or it covers a lot actually, but it's a what's it called? It's a professional
Yeah.
type radio, so it's not.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, ICOMs are great radios. I would say, when you buy the GMRS radios at London Drugs or Kane
Yeah.
Tire or whatever, they're very underpowered.
Well,
And-
agree. They will be, because you can load a power supply for them at three 1.5 volt batteries, and that means they're not going to last all day.
No. And you don't have enough signal strength, and they're UHF radios. So with a UHF
It's
radio,
shorter.
trees, buildings, the ground contour blocks the signal.
Yeah.
It's 50 miles if you're sitting on one mountain peak and the other guy is on another mountain peak and nothing between you.
Yeah, that's my take on it. So really, the type, like, I don't know, I haven't looked into whether we could actually get a license to actually have real radio, so to speak. That
Well, no, if
you-
you've got
you
a
could
call
do-
sign, you can get
No,
proper UHF, VHF radios.
Yeah, but I think we were talking more in terms of some of the neighbors here would have these and they would operate them. And what you're saying there, with a call sign, you can, of course, but there's only one call sign, and you got to be there if somebody else is using the radio. So, and there's got to be somebody at the other end who's. So it depends a little bit on what we actually are planning on using the radios for.
So what you could also do is Midland in the United States sells a mobile GMRS radio.
Yeah, they
that
have 5
is-
watts down there.
Yeah, but I think what you can do is, I think it's 25 watt. But what you could do is set it up as a repeater.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, things like that could be done,
And you put up a very, very tall antenna.
yeah, but I
So-
think what we have to actually determine first what we actually think we are going to, these radios are going to be used, what are they going to be used for? If it's from one end of the block to the other, or maybe a block over or something.
I think if you're thinking of those radios, this is where I'm sorry, I've been kind of sick the last week and I couldn't make it outside it, is to do a test with several of your members.
Yeah, we
And
have to have radios.
I'm sure that you can get out to, say, 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers.
Well, that would
and-
be, yeah, we basically do a field strength test and see
Yeah.
what areas. But the thing is, though, we have to have radios to try them out first. And
well, we do have some in the sea container.
But what are they?
They're Motorola's.
GMRS radios.
Oh, they
Yeah.
are. Okay. Well, that's exactly that's what I am saying. That would be without a license. That would be aside from a CB radio. That would be, but CB, you have very long antennas to do it properly.
Yeah.
But you would have more power. But it's no. Yeah. Okay. Well. Okay. So I'm not too far off then.
No.
And also what they do have, at least the ones that I have read the data on or specs on, they do cover some of the FRS, the family
Yes.
band,
Yeah.
but they drop to 0.5 watt. But that means that if some neighbors have these, they might still be able to stay in communication, at least on a limited distance.
And that's what Hassan and I are going to be working on over the summer.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
getting
that
off,
would be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
and
good idea.
I'll include you, Oli, as far as when we start working on the neighborhood stuff as well.
Yeah, I
And,
mean, you need a couple of people to do the,
test.
yeah,
Uh,
because it,
And, but,
John,
yeah,
what would be helpful before the test is if someone at Deep made a map of the Dunbar Deep area. And then also marked on each member's location where they live in the area.
yeah, I can work on that when I get back, because.
Yeah, and then that way, that would be the starting point. Can everybody talk to everybody from their from their property, from the front yard, the upstairs room, whatever.
Yeah,
And then
No,
we
that's-
can make a sort of a game plan.
Yeah.
Okay.
and
No.
it also means that since you already have some of those radios, that perhaps attaching a slightly more efficient antenna to the structure or the base, so to speak, that might also improve the situation a bit.
Oli, when I get back from Greece, I'll take you down to the sea container and show you what we actually
All right.
have there, to give you an idea what we're trying to work as well.
I have a question for Hassan, which is more if there's time for that. I was curious what handheld you are owner of. What
I'm just going to have to leave, and you guys can. I'll leave this open for a bit, but I have.
Okay,
to,
yeah, all right.
You can stop recording if you want, John.
Yeah, no, you guys can continue, but I just have to.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
all right.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, John.
Okay.
So
Well, what I'm thinking eventually, I'll probably have get maybe a 2-band radio, if not 3. I'm more really thinking about HF when I'm gonna, as a radio amateur. But you need some 2 meter or UHF.
well, I would say just get I have an Alinco DMR,
Yeah.
UHF, VHF.
Yeah.
And I have a whole bunch of Baofangs.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna. I know they're inexpensive, and I wasn't gonna spend $700 on the radio. So it'll have to be somewhere in there. Are you using the DMR?
I use it a little bit, but not very much. That's a whole nother world, the digital stuff.
I mean, no, I realized that because I was just asking the question the other day about in the Rainbow, what's it called, country net. There's a guy calling in from the Bay of Fundy, and he comes in on All Star or
Yeah,
and
yeah, he comes in on the digital nodes or
yeah,
IRL.
but it seems that he probably what's the I was thinking in the All-Star Echolink. So I have a feeling now, I'm kind of understanding that he probably